Hello everyone, welcome to Book 2, Night 16 of the Orphan's Tales Live Quarantine Reading Series. Good to see everyone again. I managed to do it twice this week after missing the first full week I ever missed, just due to work, but we're back, we're here, we're all here together. It's hot in here again, although it's starting to cool off here a bit. I don't know. I hope you guys are doing okay. The world is what it is. There's no need for me to be a news commentator about it. You all know what's been happening. It's terrible. As usual, I feel like I've just spent 6 months in this room saying, it's terrible. And there goes the little moth through the room again. The wine tonight is Pinot Noir. The lipstick is Bowskin Holiday Rose. That's all the capitalism I got for you this evening. Life is a silly, stupid thing, and it ends quickly, I suppose, is the lesson. So I'll do my little intro, and then we'll get right into it. I, again, have no memory of what we're about to read tonight. It could be anything, really. There's a violinist involved, I remember that. Other than that, I got nothing. For those of you who've been here from the beginning, the disappointment of the author remembering so little about her own work is a constant theme. But I'll remember as I read. I occasionally do. I do remember writing parts of this in a Starbucks in Cleveland. There's a lot of Starbucks writing in this book. It started out in Rhode Island, and I wrote in the Starbucks in Newport, Rhode Island, and then it's just the Starbucks wherever I was living at the time. So occasionally the people who are working at Starbucks really are working, and a book comes out of it, but usually not. Anyway, all right, let's do this thing. For legal reasons, as usual, this is not an audiobook of The Orphan's Tales. This is a one-woman show. You can find music based on these books at sjtucker.com. You can buy copies of them at your local independent bookseller's web portal. If you would like to patronize my local independent bookseller, that is printbookstore.com. You can catch up in the archive anytime you like at YouTube. My channel is Valente Live. You can find me on Twitter, usually ranting and raving about how terrible everything is, with the occasional picture of an adorable child to lighten things up. Leaven the loaf. At Cat Valente. You can subscribe to my Patreon at Cat Valente as well. End of month reward rush is on right now, so it's a good time to subscribe. You can ask me questions when this is over. It works better if you have them in mind before I stop talking, so that there's no uncomfortable dead air as I stare uncomfortably into the invisible lens up there. And if you are so moved, you can contribute something to my tip jar, which is on my Instagram profile, my YouTube profile, and my website, which is CatherynneandValente.com. This is a very difficult time, and anything you can contribute is deeply appreciated. Thank you so much to David G, David T, and Marielle, who tipped me last week. It really helped us out a lot this week. It means so much to me. I can't even begin to express. Really, like, the words thank you are not enough. So thank you we'll have to do until we see each other at a con or something. So thank you. And anyone else who does, I will thank you by name on the stream, unless you tell me you don't want me to use your name. So that's it. It's this time of year, I just want to shave my hair off my head. For those of you who ever see me in person, I have more hair than any one human being should have. And it just, I love my long hair generally, but in the summer, I just want to shave the whole thing off. And this is one of those days. It's a very warm day. Let's get going. All right, for those of you reading at home, we are on page 284. So zooming right along, you can see we're well over halfway through. I haven't really shown these because there's so many of them, but there's lovely little snowflake illustrations dotting several of these pages from Mr. Kaluta, the legend, the man, the mystery, the legend. Okay, here we go. In the garden. The boy stopped. "You're doing fine," said the girl warmly. She put out her hands to take his and opened her eyes. They sparkled in the firelight, and the snow in her hair had melted to dew. "Shall I bring you dinner tonight?" she laughed, "and run to escape my sister?" "It feels strange to speak to you when I am so used to listening. This is how it is in the stories I knew before you. A beautiful girl sits at the feet of a boy and treasures his every word. But it does not seem right." "This is still my story," said the girl, drawing away. "My last story. It is not yours simply because it sits in your mouth a while." I know. Please do not be angry. "And I am afraid. I shall read as slowly as I can. It is your story, and it will take you away from me at the most beautiful part. Just when I want nothing more than to read it forever, it will be over. I know it." She smoothed his hair, but could say nothing. "At least I can rest. I had become so tired, like a little place had opened in me and all of me had fallen out of it." "How can you be so tired by only reading? Are you sick?" "No, but that is the way of it. I told you it was my story. Even now you draw it out of me like a fisherman draws a carp from a lake. It thrashes and bucks as it is dragged from the water, but the sun on its scales is so golden." The boy's eyes widened, and he looked at her again, how flushed her cheeks in the cold, how thin her arms, how the black of her eyes seemed to burn like pitch. He was a little frightened of her, and she was so strange. He had almost forgotten how strange she seemed to him in the beginning, how strange she was still, and how unlike any of the girls whose black hair he had chased around the trunks of trees. "Are you tired now? Would you like me to leave you?" he whispered. And then she came back to him, her face warm and wide and winsome as an eager cat. "No, please, I want to hear more. I want to hear how Skald found the city of artists, how odd it feels not to know what happens next." He laughed ruefully and passed his braceleted hand over her eyes, closing them gently. The letters danced. He read slowly as ever, his uncertain voice sounding in the snow like a hare's footprints. "I followed the Ajan streets as I was told, and they were steeper and sharper and narrower than even I had imagined. But they whirled inexorably toward a center, and the moon was not even above the brow ridge of the gate before I found the fountain and the dancing fingerless maid." The tale of the cage of ivory and the cage of iron continued. "She was younger than I had thought. She must have been little more than a girl when Simeon had first found her. She was full grown and then some now, just over the crest of life, laughing lines at her eyes and a deep, weathered color to her brown skin. She played with both hands upon her stiff, wiry hair, and her red slip snapped crisply around her as she plied her practice steps. The song was not the dirge for a city that the gate had heard, but something sly and serpentine, staccato and sure, something that wound and writhed, something knowing, something hidden to all but her. I waited. I would not interrupt. She finally stopped, bent at the waist, her foot poised and pointed in the air. Without moving any other muscle so much as a twitch, she turned her head to the side and winked at me. The gate was wrong. Her eyes were far greener than palms, glittering with a weakly burning light I thought I recognized, but no, it was not possible. She looked me up and down, and a secretive smile unfolded on her lovely face. "Your chin," I cried, pointing like an accusing child. "No wonder that hair can play. How'd you get it to stiffen like that?" Agrafena laughed, a gravelly sound like coals raked over. "No more than a quarter, I'm afraid. And on the paternal side, more's the pity." Her eyes flashed their dim fire at me. "We do not all lie on silk cushions in the vaults of cash, you know. And like me, the hair is only a quarter smoke, enough to be reasonable if I treat it nicely." "But how? It is absolutely forbidden to mate with humans. After Kashkash died, they forced us to agree to it. So many were crushed into spoons and lamps that day. There were too many ruined maids and inoperable boys for them to countenance. There's not been a half-breed for centuries, longer." "Thank you for using such a generous word for me." But as I said, I am not half anything. I am a solid and smoky quarter breed, and if you wish to arrest someone, you shall have to dig up my grandparents. And I am sure they would be very cross about it. I did not know what to say. She was an impossibility. At home she would be burned immediately, and that part of her which was inflammable sunk to the bottom of the sea. Such was the contract the Kaigal witnessed. Such was the contract men made us sign with regard to their prettiest children. I finally settled on the simplest thing I could summon up. The gate sent me, I said simply. Simeon, it will be time for his mules soon, I should think. Is he asking you to call him Ajanab yet? Silly old farmer, but a better soul you never knew. I am from the army outside, the army of kings and queens that is waiting to flatten this place. Agrafena's eyes darkened, and even a quarter gin can go very dark indeed. Yes, I know which one you mean, she rumbled. I came within the walls to find what my siblings seek, a little carnelian casket, no larger than my arm. Your siblings. I drew my smoke up, and the jewels of my waist flashed. I am the Ember Queen. Agrafena just laughed and scratched at her scalp. And what is in this box? I don't know. Well, the queenship of Kosh is not what it used to be. I've been queen for a single day, I protested. They tell me nothing. I was lucky to learn there's a box at all. Well enough, well enough. I have no idea where such a thing might be. I've seen nothing of the sort. Carnelian is common to your country, not ours. The gate, Simeon, told me he would take me to a tall room in an ivory cage and a flame like mine. Her eyebrows arched. Did he now? Well, I suppose I know what he means. I doubt you'll find your box there, though. More likely bird droppings and an earful of prattle. Nevertheless. Of course, who am I to shirk the duty of entertaining visiting royalty? Follow me. It's not far. We moved quickly through the angled alleys, and the shadows were deep and scented below the rounded towers of Ajanab. I thought I could smell that spice smog that Simeon had loved so, or at least the ghost of it. The faintest sigh of cardamom and cumin and cinnamon breathing through the night. As we passed windows and doors, I could see jugglers throwing candelabra high in dimly lit rooms, and hear heartbreaking soliloquies delivered earnestly to tall mirrors. The night was full of voices, and every now and then a lone and tamed lion would pad by on this cracked road, his collar kept clean and crisp. Surely there was a great ring somewhere, a great stage, and I was missing even now the Ajan carnival in its full waxing. We passed through a wide square peopled with red sandstone statues, each face precise and perfect in the scarlet stone, clutching granite mirrors and marble parasols. We wound through them on tiptoe, for I was certain one of them would reach out at any moment to grip my arm. But the violin player walked tall and did not err in her steps, even when the stone crowd was far below us. Agrafena's hair stood straight out behind her, even when she was not whirling about, and I could not see her face for its mass. I suppose I was not one to talk with my ungainly baskets. Shyly, I ventured, Your hands. Yes? How did you come to have your bows? It must have been very painful. Not so much as you might think. She stopped, and though we could not fit through alleys abreast, she looked over her shoulder at me. We have time yet in your night before we reach the roost, if you're genuinely curious. I nodded eagerly. She drew me out of the little alley and sat me beside a persimmon tree caught up in a rusty iron trunk gate to protect it from climbing children. Well enough, then. I have told you already that my grandfather was a djinn. The Violinist's tale. He was born in Kosh, like the rest of you. His cradle was carnelian and brass. His smoke was bilious and soot-riddled, even as an infant, and his eyes dripped orange flame when he cried out for his mother. My grandfather, whose name was Suhail, was dissatisfied by the silent finery of Kosh, however, and chafed against the Kaigal, which was the life charted for him by the best astrologers. He wanted to find a princess with a wicked wish for a dark and handsome stranger, to whisk her away and sing her on a balcony surrounded by swans and imps. So that is just what he did. My grandmother had a long braid the color of fire and very green eyes. As all folk know, this coloring indicates a deviant and difficult disposition, and indeed, she spent her nights at her tapered window wishing for a dark and handsome stranger to come and whisk her away from a boring life of embroidery and afterbirth, and sing to her on a balcony surrounded by swans and imps. She was not entirely sure what she meant by singing, but in her books suitors always sang to their ladies, and she was determined to hear a song for herself, even if it did seem a little dreary. My grandmother, whose name was Glaucia, laced her dress very tightly and sighed loudly at her window, just as the woodcuts in her books always depicted such ladies. My grandfather, lately run off from Kosh with a silk sash like a blue fire, heard her sighing and needed no Kaigal to grant her wish. He obliged her most vigorously, and the swans trumpeted and the imps snickered, and Glaucia discovered that singing was not so very dreary after all. As it tends to do, time produced a child, a daughter with green eyes and very polite, soft black hair that never, not even once, snaked out to strangle a parrot in flight. Suhail did not know what to do. He could not send her to be educated properly in Kosh, for they would burn her and drown her in short order, and universities tended to also ask for pedigrees. But she was a mild and sweet girl, to the astonishment and consternation of both her parents, and she found a mild and sweet boy to build her a house, and was happy enough for someone who couldn't even strangle a parrot properly. Her only unhappiness was that her marriage could not be consummated. Whenever her husband drew up the covers over them, oh, how Glaucia rolled her eyes when her daughter recounted that, and reached for her, the poor girl's body melted into black smoke, every bit as oily and soot-riddled as her father's. Her husband fell right into her and found his face pressed into his own pillow. There was no end to the weeping and storming in their little house. But it seemed not to matter, for she came down with child, just like any other woman, and in the usual span produced me, whose hair immediately throttled the nearest turtle dove, to the relief and joy of my grandfather, who burst into grateful and incendiary tears at the sight. My parents settled in Ajanab, and put down a modest basil field. Everything in my childhood smelled of basil, soapy and green. But I did not love basil, nor the few small squares of garlic my father put into the ground. I loved music, and I sang before I spoke. This delighted my grandmother when she visited. She did not mind that my voice sounded much more like a rabbit roasting alive in a crackling hearth than sweet Tyrolese. But I would not give up, and when my grandfather brought me a fiddle of lava rock with a long, thin blue flame for a bow, I threw my arms around his black and bilious neck and squeezed until he could not breathe. I learned that fiddle like some children learn their figures. It was as simple and easy to me as adding up a column of numbers and presenting the tidy, graceful sum at the bottom of the page. My mother said I played too fast, and my father said that true virtuosos certainly did not dance that way while they played, but I would not stop or slow. At last, when the basil fields were still high and bright and green, I reached the limit of my abilities. I could not play faster or sweeter. I could not move my fingers in more complex patterns. My parents thought I would be satisfied then, to be the best I could. But my grandfather winked at me on his winter visit, and I knew that my hands were not yet happy. Once the family had feasted and were snoring in four-part harmony, I crept from the farmhouse and into the city proper, which was then as lawless as a ship without a brig. I sought out the cottage of Folio, who was the author, so they said, of every wonder in Ajanab. Her door was a menagerie of locks, every possible type and size, from huge brass bolts to tiny, intricate silver keyholes no wider than a needle. Wooden locks with gaping slots, and golden locks with birds carved into their faces, iron locks and crystal locks and copper locks, and locks so old and worn that only rust was left where the metal might once have been. Bronze locks and locks fashioned out of antlers, crude slate locks and locks in the shape of open, staring eyes blown from the purest and clearest glass. I had no key, and there was no spare splinter of door left on which to knock. Being a clever child, I pressed my fingers into 10 varied locks, no two of the same stuff, and heard a dozen little bells cascade their chimes through the hunched hut, alone among the campaniles of Agenab, a short, squat, stairless stack. The door creaked open in just the manner one would expect a mysterious door to creak, and the light within was rust-colored, reeking of oil and copper and burnt air. I stepped gingerly inside. The door behind me swung closed, the locks merrily going about their slotting and turning. Folio sat at her workbench, an old fig-wood plank with vices set into it and open books lying brazenly asplay. There were sketches on the walls and scraps of metal in various states of molten and hard, leaning against chairs and baseboards or puddled in molds, loose gears and pendulums and countless clocks, their innards violently exposed, metronomes endlessly ticking away, and many things whose use I could not guess. Machines of metal, precious and cheap, black with oil or draped in cloth, metallic wings and pens which wrote hurriedly with no hand to guide them, little clockwork lumberjacks who chopped ineffectually at iron stumps, and a spinning wheel whose spindle whirled contentedly all on its own. Folio had a hunchback and skin the color of fig seeds, and her spectacles, for it is well known that all inventors wear spectacles, were fashioned from clock hands, which stuck out every which way from round glass. Behind them, her dark blue eyes, the color of good dye, were luminous and calm. She was rather old, and her white hair braided in tiny strips, hundreds upon hundreds of them, piled onto each other like bridge ropes. Her lips were thin and almost blue from pressing them whilst deep in thought, and her hands, those famous hands, had 8 joints each. Her nails were very short, but her spidery hands were so delicate, plying gently a little copper sphere that spun over a fountain of steam. We have an amazing illustration of Folio here, and her hands. It's a pretty toy for a dull child, but I've been thinking about a mechanical horse, she said happily, her voice crisp as clockwork. But you surely do not care much about horses, even if they could be made of silver and weep fire from their eyes. I shrugged. My grandfather weeps fire. Well, she said archly, looking up from her spinning ball, it wouldn't be the same thing at all. My horses would have a weeping switch you could turn on and off. Young people are so hard to impress these days. I'm sure they would be wonderful. They say you make all the wonderful things in the world. That is certainly a lie. Such strange birds folk are. Make a few flying machines purely by commission, and everyone starts telling stories about you. Which is, of course, what brought you here. Come to buy a wonder, I presume. I blushed a bit. Not to buy, I'm afraid. I haven't any money. To beg a wonder, then. And what sort of miracle am I expected to produce for free from behind my ear? My violin, madam. I wish to play it as no one has played a violin before. Practice, she humphed. I can already play better than a satyr plays her pipes, I said hotly. But you should understand. What does the world need with a mechanical horse when every farmer has his own old grey nag? Who needs a horse made of silver? Weeping fire? No one. But you'll make them anyway, one day or another. I would be to other violinists as your horse will be to a bent-back dapple with flies in her nose. She glanced at my fingers. Very well said, girl. I think perhaps we can do something for you, but we will have to consider it for a while. I did not think of the horse until I watched the ball spin. Who knows where I may find your wonder. I swallowed hard. I should rather stay, madam, and help where I can. I do not need an apprentice, nor am I a hospice. Of course not, I didn't mean to say. There was a rummaging, clanking sound from behind a large stone furnace, and what spit a girl whose blood is a quarter fire can claim dried in my mouth. An extraordinary thing emerged from behind the furnace, a woman all of silver and bronze, whose body was a mass of gears and bolts and plates, with no flesh at all on her, only metal, endless metal, in her eyes 2 rolling balls of gold. She had no hair, silver or otherwise, but an oblong head, all spiked with joints and gears. Her hands ended in long, many-knuckled fingers, just like folios. The inventor turned to the creature and smiled fondly. "Our darling, you know you're not supposed to come out when company's present." The silvery woman turned and began to burrow behind the furnace again, pulling a drop cloth over her head and piling scrap on her shoulders. Folio laughed. "We can still see you, Our." All right, Mother," came a muffled, curiously flat voice. A bronze hand flashed out and dragged a large wing of tin plates over itself. "No, darling, come out. You've spoiled your hiding already." There was a great clatter as she emerged again, and the scrap fell to the flagstone floor. She stood, hanging her head, and gears whirred softly. "I'm sorry I came out, but she has bad hands," said the bronze woman, and her unmuffled voice was peculiar, something between a clock chime and a whetstone spinning. Folio turned her eyes, but none of the rest of her, and looked at my hands. "Not everyone can be so blessed as we," she demurred. "She has bad hands," the woman repeated. "Fix her hands. Violins and bows go together, not violins and hands." "Interesting." "Madame Folio," I cried in alarm, "what is that thing?" "She is not a thing, thank you very much. She is to a person what my horse will be to a nag, and what you would be to a violinist. Kindly show a little respect, and don't you go telling anyone either. There'll be no end to the outlandish strangers who will come fingering my locks for miracles." "How can you have made such a thing that walks and talks?" "You believe with all your smoky little heart that I can make you a virtuoso, but you wonder at the smallest of things. I made her. She's my daughter. There's nothing simpler in the world than that." The tale of the rooster maker's daughter. Where I grew up, the sea sometimes freezes. Just the edges, mind you, like a puddle freezes, from the edge side in. The waves would go so cold their foam came tinkling down in a shower of ice, and the beaches were hard and clear as glass. When I was a girl, I would collect the foam shards like shells, but no matter how quickly I hurried back to my house with its wide porch, I would come to the door clutching a pail of water and nothing more. My father had a very fine house. The whole dwelling was full of white curlicues and delicate fluting, breaking over the face of the house like frozen foam. But the walls were thick and solid, as they had to be, for it is cold in Muron, often as cold as Ashenab is hot. When I was not trying to ferry ice from the sea to my bedroom, I was fiddling, as my mother called it. My father did not think there was very much odd about a child fiddling, as he was a fiddler himself by trade, and fiddling had bought our curly-hued house. He worked with 4 other men and women in Muron at a peculiar export, which, not being fish, was not much noticed among the other products of the great seaside city. Between the 5 of them, they produced the most extraordinary clockwork roosters that crowed out the morning with golden beaks. This was their summer crop. In the winter, they trolled the oyster beds and carved the tropical birds of their dreams from the pearls. My father made the eyes, which flicked open and shut, not by any mechanism, you understand, simply by eyelids that rolled back and forth as you turned the little golden bird in your hands. His was a simpler trade than mine, but that is the way of parents and children. My mother was a poet who wrote long, dreamy stanzas about broken masts and hungry seas. Once she spent a year recording every shade of gray in the palette of the Muron sky. She cried out her poems at the harbor front, and young girls threw pennies at her feet. She threw up her hands like pennies when I fiddled. But once, just once, she held her hands in the freezing well water for hours and hours, and then running to the sea and back again, brought me in her blue and shaking fingers one perfect shard of foam. My father let me have a few of the finished roosters, and I took them apart in my room when I ought to have been sleeping until my floor was full of broken birds. But I put them back together again, too, learning how the crowing sound was made by a tiny bellow in the breast, piecing the poor fellows together in ways my father would have found horrifying, making great, huge cockerels with 4 or 5 beaks crowing in harmony. I read endless books with onion skin pages concerning the great fiddlers of old, the kappa and the lizard breeders, who made such things as I could never dream to touch, who wrote out the whole universe in scales on an iguana's back. Where had they gone, so that no one could now see much on an iguana but ill temper? Where had they gone, that the world was now so slow and dark when turtles once grew trees of light in their skulls? I pondered this for hours alone, as I was always content to be. Eventually, I exhausted the practical lessons of roosters. My parents wanted to introduce me to society and serve lavish teas with silver plates and watercress and costly oranges so that the white-wigged, whalebone necklace girls of Muron would come and think highly of me and introduce me in turn to their brothers. More than a few of them I induced to remove their wigs so I could count the hairs sewn into the cloth. Beyond that, I had no interest in them, as they were neither made of gold nor able to crow out the morning hours, nor did their eyelids roll back and forth if you tinted their heads. Then, of course, there were my hands. It is true that my mother had an extra joint on her smallest finger, but that seemed no good reason to have a daughter with fingers like the legs of grass spiders. They were very good for fiddling, hopeless at pouring tea, and excellent for making rich young women scream. The glove-makers shuddered in horror and turned me away. I did not care. Who can feel a bird's toothed guts with gloved hands? Finally, one of the rooster women died, the one who made the red tails, and I humbly submitted my petition to take her place. I had my own little house then, with a few small curlicues which my father assured me would reproduce in time. And from my uppermost windows I could see the crumbling sea. And tales are easy enough. I had generous portions of my days left over when those golden feathers were lined up on the shelves like red candles. And so I set aside a rooster in my sitting room and set about fiddling with it. I'm sure a kappa would have found my wonders tawdry and plain, but I am here, and they are not, and I have done as best I can. First I taught it to crow, not only the morning, but every hour of the day. This took quite some time, for first I had to teach it what an hour was. Once it reliably marked the time, I taught it to crow a great many melodies, like a little music box, and to sing a different tune for each hour. Intricate minuets for the morning, slow, sighing sonatas in the afternoon, rolling nocturnes naturally for the evening. Then, because I was lonely, and even my father did not often visit, I taught it to sing words, as it had sung tunes, and this took a very long time indeed, for there is a great deal of difference between song and word. After many lessons, which I will not bore you with, the rooster marked the hours with little nervous words, only the number of the hour at first, but then hello and mother and ice. I found it pleasant to be with, but I also found that in my 30th year I was quite tired of roosters and lonely for people. Huron is a glowering and recalcitrant place where folk do not much like to speak to one another outside tea and watercress and oranges, where the rules of conversation are fixed and true as the heavens, so that no one need tax themselves overmuch. Thus, I began the process of reshaping the rooster's outside, as I had done its inside. I had not nearly enough gold to build her in style, for I had decided to make a hen of my rooster and to call her Hour for the first thing she ever knew. There was enough only for the eyes, my father's famous eyelids, but no more. But I had a great many rooster pieces and broken clocks and broken armor and fish hooks and such. I took away her little three-toed legs first and fitted her with bronze bolts and calves and plate. She was like a siren then, a bird's body sewn to woman's legs. I gave her a new torso of silver and bronze from the armor shards, and then arms, and then the throat, a new voice lower than the chirping bird song, and a face, my beloved girl's face, that I know so well now. And finally I gave her hands like mine. And why should I not? A child takes after her parents. For a while I used one of the old white wigs for her hair, but this only made her look ridiculous. Every day I wound her like a pocket watch and set her going click, click, click. She was curious as any child. And I brought her to my parents' teas where she learned the words watercress and biscuit and speak up, no one can hear you, where we misused our egg spoons together. When we returned to the house and the moon was beaming through the frost foam, I sat her down on a chair. She had not quite gotten the trick of sitting on her own yet. She asked me, as it was the midnight hour, and she did not yet speak between her alarms. Good children are given stories at night time. Am I a good child? Of course, darling. Best child ever used her salad fork on her snails. Then I should be given a story. All right, I said. I did not really know very many stories, though I knew a great many poems. These are not the same thing, even if one takes the newer fashions of verse into account. I settled back in my own chair, and the moon curled up in my lap like a cat. Once upon a time, a maiden lived in a castle. What is once upon a time? Our interrupted. It means a very long time ago, or at least long enough ago that it would be impolite to reveal the actual number of years involved. What is lived? It means to walk and talk and eat biscuits and watercress and use one's fork improperly, and also to sleep inside a house rather than out on the stones in the cold. What is a maiden? And so I had to explain about virginity and about dowries and marriage contracts and hymens and paternity and primogeniture and various expressions of royalty, systems of rank and court etiquette. After that, I had to sketch a castle for her and explain about buttresses and moats, drawbridges and portcullises, dragons and invading armies, knights and feudalism and the general history of both architecture and comparative political systems. Then she wanted to know about weddings and how a dress would be made and feasts and how food should be prepared and the rituals of pair bonding and what a maiden turns into after she's married. It was very tiring. It took many months. And at last, when summer had come again and the dandelions had turned to white gauze, I had just finished explicating the various methods of quarrying stone and in what countries what stones were common. An hour, with her great 8-jointed hands on her knees, nodded her head with great effort. We had only begun to address nodding and shaking one's head, and said, I think I understand now. Thank you. That was a good story. Now we will pick up the rest of the Violinist tale on Wednesday. But actually, I think that there's more of it later, but actually is one of my favorite bits in the Orphan's tales, my little programming a robot via one line of a typical fairy tale. But I think we're going to get a little more from Our in the future. She's on the cover too. Our is. That's our little golden girl looking like a Terminator up there. So yeah, does anyone have any questions? I'm glad that you like it. I do very much enjoy this little section, an hour particularly. When I was between books, I was like, okay, what happens in the orange one? And I could remember the end and X thing we haven't come to yet, Y thing we haven't come to yet, Z thing we haven't come to yet, and Our. So it definitely is one of the bits that sticks in my mind. I think it was just sort of coming around to the idea that I might want to write science fiction as well as fantasy one day. So there's a couple of places where they really interact here. Yeah, Copelia. It's very much that. It's very that, as Adore Delana would say. Anyone else? Well, I'll do my little outro bit, and if you have questions, you can pop them up into the chat while I am blathering on. You can find music based on these books at sjtucker.com. You can get copies of them at your local independent bookseller's web portal. Mine is printbookstore.com. You can find me on Twitter at Cat Valente, and subscribe to my Patreon at Cat Valente. You can catch up in the archive on Cat Valente Live on YouTube. Usually updates within a day or two of this broadcast. And the next night will be on Wednesday at, it's going to be early though, because I have a Zoom class later in that evening. So we're going to do it at 7, instead of 8:30. So different fairy tale time, same fairy tale channel. And if you would like to toss a coin to your witch, this is a very difficult time for freelancers. Nothing is really sort of recovering on our end. So anything that you can contribute would be greatly appreciated. You don't have to. These are free. But if the spirit moves in you, this household would appreciate it deeply, and I will thank you by name on the next stream. Sorry to spring this question on you again. What would myth punk look or sound like outside of its literary genre? Trying to figure out how to write lyrics in a myth punk style for another project. All right, so buckle up, people. I don't know. The answer is I don't know, because myth punk was a joke that I made on my live journal. It was very tongue-in-cheek, and I don't want to say I didn't mean anything by it, because I did. I absolutely did. I was looking around in the mid-early aughts and said that there are these, particularly women, but not exclusively so, writers who are all kind of coming up together, and they were all write in this sort of similar style. Not really similar style, but there's similarities to it. And if we all lived in the same place, you'd call us something like the Bloomsbury Group gets called. But we don't, so we don't get to have a group name. Cool group name. And I was right, because who is out there, making waves right now, but like the people that I was talking about, Theodore Goss and me and Amal Matar and a bunch of other, Sonia Tafe and a bunch of other people who were just starting out then. So like that's what I was aiming toward. And people seem to have found more meaning in that phrase than I ever anticipated. And I feel like it is no longer my phrase. I am no longer the one who, I'm happy to take credit for coining it, but I'm not the authority, you're the authority. If myth punk means something to you, it's whatever it would mean to you. The defining characteristics, as I said then, was a certain anger and sort of damn the man attitude about folklore and fairy tales and mythology and what it's sort of done to the human brain, and what those stories include and exclude, and wanting to sort of break them open and dig around in their guts and make them our own. But beyond that, I mean, it's punk, man. It's whatever, pierces your ear and ruins your sheets. Like, there's no rules in punk. There's no rules in punk rock. So like, whatever punk's myth to you is legitimate. I will be no kind of gatekeeper to that. I think the fact that people did take it so seriously, and there's been myth punk cons, and there's a whole thing about it, is that there really was kind of a hunger for a word for that. For taking all of this seriously in a sort of more young and boot to the face, rather than take it seriously in a quiet stone hall kind of way. We weren't the first to do that either, but I think that we were the young of the early aughts, and the youngs of the 80s were writing different kinds of rock and roll fairy tales and stuff like that. And that's not meant to be condescending, because it really wasn't. It was a whole trend. But obviously, 20 and 30 years apart, the youths have different things to say and different concerns. But yeah, man, I can't define your punk for you. That's sort of the whole idea of punk. Obviously, as SJ is saying here, I mean, SJ and that word bonded, and that one floated around for a while. But yeah, no, there was actually the word, I thought I made it up, but I didn't Google it or anything. I just slapped it up on my blog because I didn't care about things back then. And apparently it had been used in this like role-playing game. And the guy who did that emailed me and was like, yours is better, you can have it. So it is mine. There are cons. There's a lot going on with myth punk, but I am not Mama Myth Punk, or if I am a distant sort of vodka mama, stepmama who flew the coop a long time ago. I bequeath it to all of you. It does not belong to me, it belongs to all of you. So whatever you define it as. I'm going to scroll back here because I know there was another question. The strawberry pistachio cake. Yay, I'm so glad you liked it. Did this section influence Silently Living Very Fast? Yeah, it did. I mean, the Silently Living Very Fast is in some ways just a really big digital version of this very analog character. They're very linked. I think it's the first thing I had to say about AI and certainly not the last one, but there's definitely a link between those two. Yay. But yes, myth punk is for everyone. It's one of the things that I was really hammering on about back then was that like all of those things like steampunk and cyberpunk and all that, I want the punk to mean something. I didn't want it just to mean like I wrote it now instead of 40 years ago, or like I write it but I'm cool. I wanted the energy and the anger and the frustration and the sort of rage against the darkness or whatever of actual punk rock to be sort of as emblematic of those movements as the first part of the word is. And for those of you who don't know, there for a while there, like everything had a punk on it. It just like you just took something and you stuck punk on it. Like the whole thing I call Radiance Deco Punk. As far as I know, I coined that, and it was again kind of a joke, just like taking the piss out of myself for calling something punk. But like manor punk, and there's all kinds of punk, all kind of coming back to steampunk or to cyberpunk, which then steampunk. But yeah, around the time steampunk was popular, you could call anything punk and try to pass it off. So even like the word myth punk was kind of the same thing, kind of a like, oh, we're kind of lame and cringy, but we're trying real hard. That it was a joke at my own expense, and people took it very seriously. I should not make jokes though. People take my jokes seriously, more seriously than my serious stuff sometimes. Yeah, hope punk. I heard that one. And yeah, so as with all the other jokes that went too far, I am beyond thrilled for the people for whom it is meaningful, and it is your punk movement. You rock with it. Anybody else? All right. Well, I will see you guys on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time into September. God. And I hope that you all have a lovely, lovely evening, and as lovely as evenings come in this year, and as good a Monday as 2020 knows how to make. Bye everyone. Have a good night.